What made you fall in love with Destiny? People will answer this question differently as there were many aspects that made us fall in love with Destiny 1. However, one big thing that I fell in love with that I wish would be talked about more is strike-specific loot. So today we're going to be going over all of the strike-specific loot introduced in both Destiny 1 and Destiny 2. If this ends up being helpful, make sure to hit the like button, and if you're new, go ahead and subscribe as we'd love to have you, and let's do this. Before we dive into each piece of strike-specific loot, I want to explain just what strike-specific loot is and why I loved it so much. Every strike from Destiny 1 all the way up until the end of Forsaken had strike-specific loot tied to it. Usually this armor piece or weapon was directly tied to the strike boss, which created this amazing dynamic where we would wear what we fought. These pieces were rare and gave each strike not only a purpose to do them outside of Nightfalls, but usually they looked really good, they were really strong, and they gave each strike a sense of identity. Now you may be asking, don't we have strike-specific loot in Nightfalls and Grandmasters with things like Hung Jury and Hothead that can only come from Nightfalls? No, that is not strike-specific loot. That's just strike loot, and there's a big difference. If I looked at your inventory and I saw you had a Hung Jury, I would know you got it from a Nightfall, but I wouldn't know what strike you got it from. On the flip side, if I saw somebody with the Mindbender's Ambition, back in Forsaken of course, I knew that it was from the Hollowed Lair strike. This is the problem I have with trying to replace strike-specific loot with things like Positive Outlook, Royal Entry, and Xenoclast, and other things that drop from the end of strikes. Where Destiny 2 currently stands, strikes are unfortunately pointless outside of doing them for the Pinnacle or if you're in it for the Nightfall. However, back in the day, this was not the case. With that clarification out of the way, let's get into it. We'll go in order of the strikes in the game. To start off, we have the first two vanilla strikes in Destiny 1, the Devil's Lair and the Summoning Pits. Funny enough, these are the only strikes in Destiny 1 that at the end of their life cycle never got strike-specific loot added to them, but I kinda give it a pass because they were the introductory level 8 and level 10 strikes, and they ended up getting strike-specific loot later when it came to being the Sepiks Perfect and the Abomination Heist strikes that were added in Rise of Iron. We'll talk more about those later when we get to the Rise of Iron strikes. Moving on from those two strikes, we have the Nexus Mind. This dropped the Mark of the Nexus Undone, which was a Titan mark that looked extremely cool when it was added. I love that strikes would exclusively drop loot for one class, incentivizing players to try out different classes. Next, we have the Winter's Run strike with the Archon's Priest. The famous Stolen Will shotgun got added to the strike when it got a Taken version. This was the Taken shotgun that people still talk about to this day. We have to talk about one of the most iconic strikes next because of its legendary opening. The Cerberus Vey 3 strike, better known as the Valus to Arc strike. This could drop the scout rifle that was only available in 3 Cabal-themed strikes. It was called the Treads Upon Stars, and it was a really cool scout rifle. Staying on the topic of Cabal strikes, we have the Dust Palace and some of my favorite strike-specific loot of all time. They did something that they still have not replicated. At the end of this strike, there were 3 Scion bosses, 1 Arc, 1 Solar, and 1 Void. Based on the last Scion Flare you killed, you had a chance of getting their cloak to drop for the Hunters. So Hunters had the chance of getting 3 different cloaks within this strike, and this had the community grinding the heck out of this strike. This strike also dropped the Treads Upon Stars as well, this being the second of the 3 Cabal strikes that I was referring to. The next 2 strikes we're going to talk about came out during Dark Below. The first is the Will of Crota, good ol' Omnigul. I'm sure we can all hear the screams in our head. Omnigul could drop one of the best weapons in the game, the Grasp of Malik. This literally sent the community in a frenzy and everyone was grinding the strike trying to get the perfectly rolled pulse rifle. This strike also dropped the Omnigul Bond for Warlocks that was pretty cool and something most Warlocks wanted to get their hands on. The second of the 2 Dark Below strikes was the Undying Mind. This strike got the legendary Imago Loop, which was a huge addition after the sunsetting of one of the best weapons in the game, the Fatebringer. People tried for weeks and weeks on end to try to get the perfect Imago Loop to replace their Fatebringer. This strike could also drop the Mark of the Undying Mind for the Titan, another really cool incentive for Titans to get in so they could show this off. Moving on to House of Wolves, only 1 strike was added, but I can assure you the boss of the strike made more than 1 appearance. We have the Shadow Thief, with the one and only Taniks as the boss. In this strike, you could get your hands on the Cloak of Taniks, which is one of the most sought after items in the game. It looked amazing, and Taniks had other goodies as well. He had the Does Not Bow auto rifle, which was a really cool weapon. He also had an LMG that could only drop in 2 fallen strikes, and this being the first. The machine gun that was called the Baron's Ambition. I guess we had to get the Baron's Ambition before we could get the Mindbender's Ambition in the future. Next, it's time to talk about the Taken King strikes, which were a lot of people's favorite strikes in the game. The first being the Shield Brothers. This was the third of the 3 Cabal strikes that I mentioned that could drop the Treads Upon Stars. What this strike was more known for though was dropping the legendary Mauler's Gauntlets for the Titan. These look awesome and literally looked like we ripped the arm right off of the Shield Brother. So many people were grinding this strike constantly to get them to drop. Moving on, we have another fan favorite in the Sunless Cell strike with the infamous Ala Kul. This strike could drop my favorite helmet in the game, the Dark Blade's helm. Literally the head that fell off of Ala Kul we could wear. the embodiment of wearing what we fight. We also could grind for a fusion rifle called the Dark Blade Spite. These two items were more than enough reason to have Guardians grinding this strike over and over and over again. Next we have the Fallen Saber Strike. This strike could drop the Devouring Maw, a really cool Warlock helmet that was more than enough reason to hop in and grind for it. This was also the second Fallen Strike that I was referring to that could also drop the Baron's Ambition machine gun. Lastly, we have the Echo Chamber for the Taken King strikes. This strike could also drop the Imago Loop, the fabled Fatebringer 2.0. However, since this was a PlayStation exclusive strike, more people grinded the Undying Mind for this hand cannon versus the strike. Speaking of buying things, one thing that I buy a lot of is unfortunately fast and greasy food. No more of that, because today's sponsor is Factor. Factor makes life easy, where no longer do I need to either worry about A, going and getting fast food, but B, cooking too, because another thing that can take a lot of time is cooking, and I don't always have a lot of time to cook. So the really nice thing about Factor is they have meals like the jalapeno beef and mac and cheese, where all I need to do is throw it in the oven or throw it in the microwave, and then it's ready to go. So use my link in the description or go to go.factor75.com and use my code you see here on the screen for 50% off your first box, and let's go eat some food together. Thank you so much to Factor for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to it. On top of this amazing hand cannon, we had the Theosian Fabrice, which was a really cool looking Warlock gauntlet. I remember grinding for these back in the day. Next, let's talk about the April update. We actually got a strike during the April update as well, the Blighted Chalice. This is where we got to fight Malak, which was a rush of a fight back in the day. This was our first time meeting Savathun's son, and it was awesome to fight him after earning the Grasp of Malak pulse rifle from Omnigul. In this strike, we got the Hood of Malak, a hunter helmet that looked insane. It was literally his head. Once again, another reason that D1 armor was just so good. This helmet had everyone grinding for it. Now it's finally time for Rise of Iron, so let's talk about those strikes we mentioned earlier. The first being Sepix Perfected, the Siva version of the Devil's Lair. First we have the Sepix Deposed Bond, which was pretty cool, especially back in the Destiny 1 days to have something with Rasputin's mark on it. On top of this, we had the Powerhouse Sniper, the Devil's Dawn, that could drop from this strike as well as the next two strikes on our list as well. Staying on the subject, we have the Abomination Heist Strike. This was the remake to the Fogoth Strike, or the Summoning Pits. As I mentioned, this is the other strike that could drop the Devil's Dawn. This sniper was a beast, so players spent tons of time grinding these strikes. This strike also could drop the Mongrel's Ogre Grasp, which were the Hunter arms. I really was happy that Bungie did both of these revamped strikes justice in the strike-specific loot department in Rise of Iron. Lastly, we have the Wretched Eye, which was an awesome strike added in Rise of Iron. The boss fight was crazy and the Nightfall was absolutely brutal for those that remember. This strike was another way to get the Hood of Malak helmet that was more so grinded in the Malak strike. You could also get the Devil's Dawn sniper from the strike as well. Lastly and exclusively, you could get the Anathema cannon mark for Titans in this strike. I remember spending multiple skeleton keys back in the day trying to get these. And that was the final strike to come out in Destiny 1. Then we had Destiny 2 Vanilla come and keep this trend alive. However, it was slightly different in Destiny 2 where they had to drop from the Nightfall version of the strikes, which I didn't love as much, but I was still happy that there was loot tied to the strike specifically. Also, cosmetic items could be strike-specific loot, which was another change that was made that ultimately I was fine with. Starting off, we had the Arms Dealer strike that could drop the Tilt Fuse Sparrow. I remember it taking me ages to get this Sparrow to drop, but I was so happy when it did. Moving on, we have what used to be the shortest strike until it was updated in the Lake of Shadows. This is where we originally, and I have to say originally because they were all brought back for Grandmasters for the most part, but this is where we originally got the Malicious Birthright grenade launcher. This was a trend that we'll see continue down the line. Next we have the Savathun Song strike that I wish would have returned this season with Titan coming back. This is where the legendary Taiko went down with a squad of 9. In this strike, we could get the Duty Bound, which has now also been added to Grandmaster Nightfall loot. Not talked about as much, but still in the game, we have the Exodus Crash strike as well. This could drop the Impact Velocity Sparrow. I really love this Sparrow and I grinded this strike tirelessly for it. A strike that we saw the boss return to recently was the Pyramidian strike, which ended up making an appearance in the Vexcalibur mission. The strike had the Silicon Neuroma sniper tied to it back in the day. This sniper has since made a return in the Grandmaster Nightfalls. Lastly, in the Red War era, we had the Inverted Spire introduced. I love this strike and it was fun playing it in the beta of Destiny 2 as well. There was a cosmetic tied to this strike being the Trichromatic Ghost Shell. This was a ghost that I wore a lot once I was finally able to get my hands on it. Next, we had 2 strikes added in everybody's favorite DLC, Curse of Osiris. In this, we got one of my favorite strikes in Tree of Probabilities with one of my favorite weapons in the DFA. This was an awesome hand cannon back in the day because it was one of the only 2 hand cannons that had Rampage back then. The other was Midnight Coup. Thinking back to grinding this weapon gives me so much nostalgia and was a big reason my channel grew. We used to love helping people get this weapon. The other strike we got in this DLC was the Garden World Strike. This strike could drop the universal wave function ship that I still use a lot to this day. Now let's talk about one of my favorite periods in Destiny 2, Warmind. 3 strikes were released during this era. The first strike being Strange Terrain, where we got to fight Oryx's son Nokris. This Nightfall could drop the Braytech Osprey rocket launcher. The amount of grinding I did during this era to get this weapon was insane. Next, let's talk about my favorite strike in Destiny 2, the Will of Thousands. I really wish this strike would come back. Will of Thousands dropped the Zol Transmat effect that I still have equipped to this day. I hope the Curse of Osiris and Warmind strikes will make a return one day since so few new strikes are being added. Lastly, we have the Insight Terminus strike for this DLC. This strike dropped the sniper rifle similar to Pyramidion, only this time it was the Long Goodbye sniper rifle. It was a pretty cool weapon when it originally released. Moving on, we have to talk about most people's favorite era of Destiny 2 being Forsaken. We have 4 strikes that we have to talk about. The first strike being Warden of Nothing. This strike is still in the game, unlike some of its counterparts. If your RNG was good, you could get your hands on the double barrel hand cannon, the Warden's Law. This was such a unique weapon that was really sought after. It didn't end up ever becoming the meta, but it was really cool to have for collection's sake. Next, we have the Broodhold strike. This was originally a PlayStation exclusive strike, so it didn't come with strike specific loot. The strike has since been removed from the game, unfortunately. Speaking of removed strikes, let's talk about the Hollowed Lair strike next. This was a strike that wasn't most people's favorite due to a really long boss fight, but was one that everybody grinded to try to get their hands on the Mindbender's Ambition shotgun. This was one of the best shotguns in the game at the time and had a lot of people grinding for hours and hours and hours. This shotgun has since returned, but unfortunately it's not as good as it was back in the day. Lastly, we have everyone's favorite strike, the Corrupted. This was a strike that had more of a negative vibe, but overall it was pretty cool. It was just really long. This strike could drop the Horror's Lease pulse rifle, which was a really fast-firing pulse rifle that made it spicy in the Crucible. Just like some of its counterparts, this has made a return in Grandmaster Nightfalls. It's honestly safe to say that all the strike-specific loot in Destiny 2 will eventually make a return in Grandmasters, so it's probably only a matter of time before we see the Warden's Law next. And thus, that concludes our Forsaken strikes. Moving on to the Shadowkeep strikes. Oh, wait. This is where the story unfortunately ends. When the Shadowkeep strikes launched, strike-specific loot was removed and it hasn't returned since. It's really sad to see one of the best things that Bungie has ever brought to the game that added so much additional grind to these game modes axed. Even if it was just one small cosmetic from the Eververse put into each strike, that would be enough to get people playing and grinding. Oh well, strike-specific loot, unfortunately as we know it, is dead. But my question to you is, what is your favorite piece of strike-specific loot, and do you want to see it return? Thanks for watching.